came down from the Moorhead area. They drove down this morning, so they are dedicated staff. We want to thank them for coming down. Just some housekeeping things. Please keep your phones mute. I also want to remind you that you'll be getting a survey shortly and after the end of the presentation, and we really appreciate your comments. And we will have the materials posted on HB 101 later this week. If you have questions, we're going to take questions at the end of the presentation, and please use the Q&A box if you have questions for our presenters. If you're having a technical issue, use the chat box, and Jeremy Galley is here doing some of our technical expertise, and he will try to help you as best he can. So now I would like to turn this over to Jean Colo-Johnson to start the presentation.
Hi there, I'm Jeannie Colo-Johnson, as Heidi mentioned. I'm the interim regional manager for the Northwest region of Minnesota for Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services. I also have the pleasure of working as a specialist. We are thrilled, actually, to have this opportunity to spend some time talking with you about hearing loss, how it impacts people in ways that you can better provide services for those people.
Hi there, this is Liz Brown, and I'm in the Metro office of Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services. I work as a specialist, and we serve the 7-county metro area. And again, we're excited to be here with you today.
Hello, this is Jerry Geist. I am a Deaf and Hard of Hearing specialist and work out of the Moorhead office. I'm responsible for the Northwest region, 22 different counties. And I'm really looking forward to this presentation as well.
Something that's unique about this presentation, at least I think that it is that because Liz, Jerry, and I provide the same services, but because Liz works in the metro region and Jerry and I work in greater Minnesota, we'll be able to give you perspectives from both the very metro side of things and then also the greater Minnesota perspective. And so we're really looking forward to sharing those different outlooks with you today. The first thing, or our goal for all of you today is to help you meet your consumer needs by providing effective communication. So we're really looking forward to helping you work with the people that you serve. And of course, the first thing that you need to do that is to be able to communicate with them. To do that, we've got some specific objectives. We first have to fill your toolbox. The toolbox that you need to serve your consumers is effective communication. So we're going to give you that toolbox by defining effective communication. We are going to explain the underlying issues that are associated with hearing loss, the different things that impact people, just to give you a better understanding of those folks who show up for services, some different things that they've experienced throughout their lives. We're also going to create space in your toolbox by showing you that you really definitely should never, ever, ever, ever assume anything when you're talking to folks who have hearing loss. That's going to come up throughout our presentation. Then we're going to actually give you the tools to fill that toolbox by giving you different communication strategies, and then also we're going to give you some different resources that you can use when those folks come to you if you're not sure exactly what to do.
Okay, and we're going to start with effective communication. We've all heard the phrase, you know, communication is a two-way street. And that is definitely the case when you're working with someone with a hearing loss. Information is being delivered and information is being received. And most of us in our very comfortable positions of sharing information that relates to our day-to-day roles, sometimes information rolls off of our tongues and rolls off of our hands at the speed of lightning. We often believe that the delivery was definite, it was clear, and it is complete. What can happen, though, is that the person who's receiving the information may be receiving it for the first time, and we all know that we perform much more effectively when we actually understand the information that's being given to us and have heard it more than one time. As service providers, we can do a couple of things to sort of ensure that valuable information is understood. And later during the presentation, we will share some communication tips, communication strategies on what has been effective for us in working with individuals with a hearing loss, whether they be deaf, whether they be deafblind, hard of hearing, or late deafened.
And since we're talking about communication, I am noticing we're getting a lot of messages that people's audio is not working. And if you are having problems hearing or on the computer, please do the call-in feature. Then you will be able to hear. Is that correct, Jeremy?
Yes. I believe that the dial-in feature is working, and that anybody that's having problems is probably having problems because they're using their computer to try and listen to the audio over on their computer as opposed to dialing in on the phone.
Okay, we're going to start off with a term that is critical in serving persons who are deaf and hard of hearing, and that term is effective communication. The Department of Justice revised the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, Titles 2 and 3, back in 2011. These regulations affect the obligations of those of us in state and local government, Title II, and those of you who are working under private entities or places of public accommodation, Title III. This includes an obligation, this new guideline or newer guideline includes an obligation to provide effective communication not only to the individual with the hearing loss, but to companions who are individuals with disabilities. The term companion means a family member, a friend, or an associate with whom the public entity or business would typically communicate. Some examples, just a few examples of what we call common auxiliary aids and services would include, specifically for assigning deaf individuals, qualified sign language interpreters in person or through video remote interpreting, VRI services, or note takers, or written materials, or caption phones, and CART, computer-assisted real-time transcription. That's similar to what you would see happening in a courtroom, sort of the work of the court reporter. So, CART is useful also to people who are deaf, but they don't use American Sign Language to communicate. We call those people oral. And, or they have a hearing loss, and again, they don't use sign language at all. These aids will be discussed in more detail later during the presentation as well. The goal is to ensure that communication with people who have these disabilities, hearing loss, is equally effective as communication with people who do not have disabilities or a hearing loss. Okay, going on to the next slide with effective communication. Both the ADA and Section 504 of the Rehab Act of 1973 actually use the term effective communication. And if you look at Section 8.6 under communications, under Section 504, what you're going to find is a number of guidelines and responsibilities that are responsible to any of us who are service providers. And I'm going to share with you 4 or 5 of them, maybe 4 of them, just so you get an idea of what is actually included in this communication section of Section 504. The recipient or the service provider will take appropriate steps to ensure effective communication with applicants, with beneficiaries, and members of the public. Also, the recipient will furnish appropriate auxiliaries, aids, where necessary, to afford an individual with handicaps an equal opportunity to participate in and enjoy the benefits of a program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. And you notice the word handicaps. Well, remember, this is terminology from back in the 70s. The recipient also needs to, in determining what auxiliary aids are necessary, the recipient should give primary consideration to the request of the individual with the handicap. When a recipient communicates with applicants and beneficiaries by phone, telecommunication devices for the deaf is in the language of 73, which means TDD, and sometimes you will hear TTY. That's technology that's similar to what we call the mobile phones. There are a few seniors that may have still TDDs or TTYs, but today video phones and video relay service and video remote interpreting is the type of telecommunication that's used for most persons with a hearing loss today, especially those who are deaf. And I am going to stop there because there's a lot more that could be said, but if you're really interested in the law, which I enjoy, you can go and find that under Section 504.
I tend to be all about the people, and of course this next slide kind of demonstrates that. This is Jeannie. In 2000, when I worked for the division Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services, we had brochures that said 1 in 10 people has a hearing loss. Those same brochures now say 1 in 5 people has a hearing loss, great enough to impact your ability to communicate with people. That's a huge impact. 1 in 5 people has a hearing loss. When you look at the population 65 to 74, that number jumps up to 1 in 3. And when you talk about people who are 75 and older, that number jumps up to 1 in 2. So half of all senior citizens 75 and older have a hearing loss. When you look at people who are coming to you seeking services because of housing, or if you're talking about people who are chronically experiencing homelessness, those numbers actually probably increase because you're talking about people who don't have consistent access to health care. Hearing loss can be higher, you can experience higher rates of hearing loss because of hypertension, chronic diabetes, and also chronic heart disease, because all of those have an impact on all of the small blood vessels around your ears, and that creates a greater risk of hearing loss. The other issue that is impactful when you're looking at the population that we're talking about today is the fact that those folks likely don't have access to hearing aids. They don't have the ability to clean hearing aids. They don't have access to batteries for their hearing aids. And so those are all issues that are important for you to really be aware of. The aging population is starting to move into issues related to housing. More and more people are showing up needing help because of that economic downturn, the most recent one where people lost their retirement savings. Now they need help with housing. They're stuck. When you talk about services for veterans, hearing loss is a huge issue. It's the biggest disability that veterans returning from active duty are coming back with, hearing loss and tinnitus. And so it's something that you have to pay attention to.
This is Liz, and I'm going to go back one slide because I skipped over the Fair Housing Act. Fair housing does not really use the language effective communication in that particular law. However, what the Act basically says is no qualified person with a disability shall, solely on the basis of disability, be excluded from, participation in, be denied the benefits of, or otherwise be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity that receives federal financial assistance. And that's why I wanted to come back, because the link or the common thread that runs through both Section 504 and the Fair Housing Act is the fact that entities receive federal financial assistance. And now I'm going to skip ahead to where I should be and start on underlying issues related to hearing loss. When you look at the graphic in front of you, what you see is an iceberg. And when we look at hearing loss, what we're looking at is just the very tip of the iceberg. We just see a person has a hearing loss. That's all we know when we initially meet them. The longer we work with them, sometimes they will identify themselves as someone who's deaf or someone who is hard of hearing. They will label themselves. Hard of hearing being individuals who have some residual hearing, and communicate orally. Those individuals who are deaf are individuals who have no residual hearing and communicate using sign language. They identify themselves as deaf. The impact of all of these factors that you're looking at that support the tip of the iceberg vary from person to person. An individual's educational background or lack of, their linguistic skills or lack of, their positive cultural influences or lack of, and all of the other factors you see listed here, represented here, impact how effective a person will be able to communicate, share information, and understand information. If the educational system fails them, then reading skills are adversely impacted, which then impact or cause struggles in their vocational and employment world. When some of those building blocks are not laid firmly, other areas are not laid on solid foundations. Of course, the opposite is also true. When the underlying factors are strong across the board, then success is the result. As we continue with underlying issues, let's look at some of the barriers. It's common that persons with a hearing loss face barriers coming right out of the gate. Suppose you are working with an individual with the hearing loss, and you're having to gain information or gather information regarding their medical history. It's quite possible that the person does not have readily medical history. Maybe it wasn't shared in the family. Maybe the person was not with the family when it was discussed. Either way, there was a gap. Jeannie has already shared that some families, many families have, not yet, huh?
I haven't shared that yet.
Oh, so now you know. When we talk, we sometimes talk shoot from the hip, and then when we are sitting before you, we stick to the notes. What Jeannie will share later is that many families, about 90% of families that have children who are deaf, the parents are hearing. And because communication becomes a challenge at the very beginning, and those years from birth to 3 years old where information is really critical, sometimes, again, that deaf child just does not have ready access to information about parents' health and their health. It could be just an oversight, but nevertheless, the information is missing. As an adult, if they have been homeless for a while, that information may have been gathered and lost because they've moved from place to place, or maybe it was never communicated to them clearly and they really just don't know. Another situation that could occur is when a person is hospitalized and the hospital is not compliant and just doesn't provide either interpreting services if the person is deaf, or their hearing aids have been misplaced if they're hard of hearing, and either way, information was missed because sometimes as service providers, there's an assumption that, oh, they have a hearing loss, they must be able to lip read, and then that's sufficient, or writing notes, that's sufficient. And often it is not. Let's shift now to the economic barriers. Research has shown that underemployment and unemployment those two rates are higher among persons with a profound hearing loss. And these two elements lead to more financial struggles. There's a need to purchase items daily or for daily use. And sometimes even if when persons had jobs, they did not have hearing aid coverage. That's very common. A hearing aid is just that small device placed in or around the ear, and it actually amplifies sound. Those hearing aids can range anywhere from $1,500 to $7,000 for a set. For assistive listening devices like Pocket Talkers, those devices are really effective in one-to-one meetings. They run about $150. FM systems, another effective communication device, assistive listening device, they run anywhere from $600 to $1,500 for small group settings. Often they're not provided by service providers, even though they could be really effective. Okay, alerting devices, and then I'm going to give up the mic. I'm sort of a mic hog here at the beginning. Alerting devices like an alarm clock or visual alarm clock that deaf folks use cost more than the average alerting device. For example, a regular smoke alarm, we can go into Menards and pick it up for $10, $15, $20. But a visual smoke alarm, which also needs to be ordered from a company that actually works with devices that are specifically made for those who have a hearing loss, those smoke alarms cost anywhere from $150 to $180. Another item that, or an issue, a barrier that the person with the hearing loss might be facing when you're working with them is that these items have been misplaced or possibly even stolen, causing the person to be in need.
When we talk about underlying issues, another issue to be aware of is that a person who has hearing loss may have a different knowledge base than what most people with typical hearing has. This is where we caution you with the whole never make assumptions statement. You can't assume that a person who is deaf has a lack of information, and you can't assume that that person knows everything that you know. Liz alluded to the fact that 90% of all deaf people are born to hearing parents. Hard of hearing people also, if they wear hearing aids, don't still have the same access to information that you and I have. This is a picture of a family sitting around a dinner table having a lovely conversation. At least that's what I'm assuming. It could be that dad is making fart jokes and the kids are laughing and mom is chastising. Who knows? But the point is that they're all able to engage in this conversation. If you have a person with a hearing loss, that person is either faking it and not really truly engaged in the conversation because they need to have some visual form of communication. I know that as I was growing up, I learned a lot about my family heritage growing up. We had always a certain set of dishes that my dad bought for my mom when he was stationed in Okinawa. Those dishes always came out for the holidays. If I were a deaf person growing up in a family that did not use sign language, that's information that I would have completely missed. So that's a piece of my heritage that I want to have. So that goes to what's called a fund of knowledge. Information about having to recertify every year for medical assistance or SNAP benefits. Information, I worked with a person with a criminal record. and he had a terrible, he really struggled to find housing. And because of, he had an extreme situation where he really didn't have a fund of knowledge about many, many things. So this was an extreme issue or situation, example. But he thought that if he just moved to a different county, that criminal record would not follow him. But that's because people didn't ever intentionally sit and communicate with him. He didn't have exposure to language. He really has no knowledge of how systems work. So you really need to be cognizant that people may not have an awareness of how systems work. They may not have knowledge of what their family heritage is, what their culture is, what their health history is, like Liz mentioned. Many families don't even learn how to communicate. Another really great example that I love is I worked as an interpreter for many, many years, was in a second grade class. It was Mother's Day. Kids had the opportunity to make their moms Mother's Day gifts, and they had to write their moms' names on the project. So my student said, hey, how do you spell mom? M-O-M. No. I tried to get my student to write his mom's name on the project. Well, he thought his mom's name was mom, spelled M-O-M. Other hearing kids hear people calling their moms by their given name all the time. So they just assimilate that information, but because the student had never been taught intentionally his mother's name, he thought his mom's name was mom, M-O-M. So that's just another example of information that people miss. And people who have hearing aids and are hard of hearing miss information too all the time. So you just really need to be aware of that. Learned helplessness is another situation or issue that we need to be aware of. Sometimes the people that we work with who have hearing loss, and this could be other individuals that you're working with as well, but people who have hearing loss may seem to be unable to solve problems. They may lack motivation. They have low self-esteem, when really what it could be is learned helplessness. They've grown up over the years. They've struggled to communicate, and so they have helpers throughout the years. Could be a deaf student in a rural setting. They grow up, they go into preschool, they have the same interpreter all the way through 12th grade. This interpreter isn't a certified qualified interpreter. This is a para who learns some sign language, never learned about the code of ethics, never learned about being relied on for everything. And so this interpreter has the best of intentions and says, oh, I'll go tell the teacher for you. I'll go ask the coach if you need to be at practice. So the student learns that they can't do it themselves. They need someone else to do that. They learn that they themselves are the problem, and they start to really internalize that, and that really becomes pervasive, permanent, and they're no longer able to advocate for themselves or do things for themselves. They lack those coping skills mechanisms, and it really becomes a part of who that person is. It's difficult to rewrite that person's brain wiring or rewrite that narrative, I can't do anything. I've worked with people like that. It took 6 years it's taken people as long as 6 years to start to learn that they're not able to, or that they're actually able to request interpreter services because they have that right, because they've learned over time that even if they request accommodation, they can't have it because they're told too many times, and then they just say, I can't have it. Even if I request it, it's not my right. I won't get it anyway. So it's really important if somebody makes it known to you that they can't communicate that you're respected, because if you're working with a population that has mental health issues, that has chronic homelessness, that is, I mean, the people that we serve are not the people who are really in a great place in life. And quite often those are the folks who struggle to advocate for themselves as well. Liz has an example to share.
Okay, I won't take long with this one, but as Jeannie was talking, I thought of several situations. One situation was a young man working in a particular area, and his father worked with him, and his father's best friend worked with him. Well, for many, many years, for about 13 years, really, the father was there. And while the father was there, whenever there was conflict or there was issues with the materials that they were working on, and the father would just, because this is his son, he would resolve the issues, but he never taught his son how to resolve the issues. So when clients called into the company saying, this is what I ordered, but this is what I got, the father would take care of it. Well, you know what happened. The father passed. But when the father passed, we still have a young man who's working at the same level he was working at when he first started 13 years ago. Well, now the father's friend has taken up for him. He's replaced the father in providing assistance for any type of challenges. So this young man is not learning to problem solve at all because someone has taken that responsibility from him. And after being upset about it, after the friend actually left the job, retired, the young man noticed that everyone that he came in with was moving up the ladder, and he was not. So he went and complained to his manager that, you know, it seems to be some unfairness going on here, some discrimination. Well, then he called our office, and what we had to do was just do some backtracking, learn what we just learned, what I just shared. And the young man had to be told that you're still functioning at an entry-level position, and that's why you haven't been advanced. You have not advanced within the company. But again, that learned helplessness is an actual reality.
If you go on to the next slide, you'll see that employment is a big issue for people with hearing loss. Even a person who is hard of hearing experiences lower incomes because they struggle with issues in employment. Over a lifetime, a person who has hearing loss can earn as much as $300,000 less than a typically hearing person. And that earning power decreases with the increase in their hearing loss, if that makes sense. A person who is hard of hearing and wears hearing aids can struggle with the telephone. It can actually generate some anxiety for some people who have hard hearing loss. And so when you think about going to work and knowing that that job is actually going to require that you answer the telephone, that can be intimidating for some people. Not all people, again, but for some people. Something that people who have a hearing loss have to think about is, do I disclose to my potential employer that I have a hearing loss that impacts my ability to communicate with potential consumers or customers or with my boss? Do I need my supervisor to purchase a special phone for me so that I can communicate? Am I going to need captioning for workshops? I can do fine in face-to-face situations, but I need someone to take notes during meetings. Do I actually have to request an interpreter for an interview? It's going to cost a supervisor money to hire me. Do I disclose that, request an interpreter, and risk not even getting an interview? These are all issues that a person who has a hearing loss has to consider before they even get in the door for a job. So employment issues can be quite overwhelming for a person who has a hearing loss. Mental health. The deaf population is the most underserved population in the U.S. Studies have actually shown this. That is true for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is that there are not enough culturally appropriate services for the deaf population. Culturally appropriate services means the services that can be provided by somebody who uses ASL to communicate directly face-to-face. Somebody who is familiar with deaf culture, there's a separate culture with very specific implications when you're talking about the provision of mental health services. Another issue related to mental health services and mental health issues for people who are deaf and hard of hearing is health illiteracy. People who are deaf or hard of hearing may not even be aware that depression can be an issue. So they may be walking around with diagnosable depression, but they don't even know that they should mention it to their doctor. If you don't know that you should mention it to your doctor, you don't mention it to your doctor, you're never treated. Same thing with anxiety and a variety of other things. Providers aren't aware of culturally appropriate services for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. And the other issue surrounding a provider's lack of awareness is the risk of a potential misdiagnosis. And you can actually take that discussion in a variety of ways. A really good example of that is questions in assessment related to paranoia, for example. If you ask a deaf person, do you feel like people stare at you? Sometimes they might say yes, because people are interested in ASL. People stare at deaf people when they sign sometimes. So that deaf person might say, yep, I feel like people stare at me. So on that assessment, they may score higher because they think people stare at them, when really it's just because they use ASL. That's a culturally appropriate response. Yes, people look at me, but in terms of that mental health score, it's going to skew things a bit. I personally have a hearing loss on my right side. I look behind me quite often on my right side because I can't hear if someone's coming up behind me. So it might actually look like I'm paranoid because I'm constantly looking behind me. If you're talking about a person who is hard of hearing, who is a senior citizen, they're sitting in, Joe is hard of hearing. He's sitting at a senior center with his group of friends. Betty has stage 4 cancer. The group comes up with a meal train. Joe is completely unaware of what's going on. He looks like he has Alzheimer's. It's actually because he can't hear anything or understand what anybody is saying. So you really have to be cautious about what you say in terms of what's mental health, what's hearing loss, and how does that hearing loss really impact this person's mental health. The other thing that I would always caution you is to never say, never mind, or I'll tell you later, because those are phrases that are incredibly hurtful, painful things, and people who have hearing loss have heard them over and over and over again. Never make assumptions. Never make assumptions. You could be serving a person who is deaf or hard of hearing, who has a PhD, is incredibly smart, just happens to be down on their luck. You could be talking about a person who is on the complete other continuum. You just have no way of knowing until you actually take the time to get to know this person.
Okay, I am going to do some discussion about the deaf and hard of hearing community and different groups within the deaf and hard of hearing community. They have their own definition for each group. So there's deaf, hard of hearing, latent deaf, and deaf-blind. They all have their own special needs, different communication. It's not the same amongst all. So I will kind of expand on each category. The first one I mentioned, deafness, is a profound hearing loss, and they really depend on their visual desire for communication, such as sign language. The effective communication method would be manual communication, speech reading, writing, gesture. That tends to be for that group. The hard of hearing group, people with some type of hearing loss, could be mild all the way to profound. And they tend to have the ability to speak for themselves, and to understand some auditory. The third group would be latent deaf. And You know, they tend to, you know, acquire language before becoming deaf. So typically they will continue to speak for themselves. Maybe would now depend more on visual cues. For example, CART, like Liz had mentioned, and they would also use hearing aids or some sort of assistive device. But that doesn't always help. Assistive devices are not always helpful in that category. The last one would be deafblind. Deafblind is a combination of a visual and hearing loss that prevents communication and receiving information from a group and being involved in community activities. To maintain independence is key for this group. Deafblind doesn't always mean fully blind and fully deaf. It could be a variety of levels of hearing loss and vision loss within that group. All right, just looking at where we are next. So native language, yes. ASL itself is a very complex visual language, typically American Sign Language, and in Canada, where they speak English, ASL is also used there. The visual components obviously depend on sight, the ability to receive information visually. The spatial or gestural language uses body movements to provide information. Let's see, where am I at? ASL itself is a native language. It was developed within the deaf community, and they have created a grammatical structure for the language as well. And now, for example, the syntax and grammar if you're talking about English structure, English language structure, ASL has its own grammatical structure apart from English. It is not the same or not equivalent to English. ASL has their own set of rules grammatically. ASL has a sentence structure that is very different. So it would seem as though it's broken English, like mime or gesture. It does not have the grammatical structure to a language, whereas ASL does. So for example, English would be, the boy chased the cat. That would be a typical, you start with the subject, do the verb, and then the object. That's a typical grammatical structure for English. In ASL, the grammatical structure is quite different. You typically do the topic, comment, or you do the object, subject, verb. For example, that same sentence would be the cat, the boy chased. So that's exactly how the ASL structure would be to that exact English sentence. Now, if you're trying to compare the grammatical structure, you will find that ASL structure tends to be very similar to the Navajo or Japanese. Very similar sentence structure, but not so much to English. Some people think ASL is just a gestural language. And in a way, yes, it is. But ASL does use, their hands to sign. But we also have other components that are included in the language. For example, your facial expression with your eyes, your eyebrows, your mouth, your body is all included in the components of the language. That's what really makes up ASL as its own language.
Okay, so on to the next slide. Code switching. All right. So code switching is commonly used in the deaf community. It's when a deaf person meets with a person who is hearing and they begin signing. Oftentimes the deaf person will look at the hearing person's signing skills, and if it's evident that they don't use English or ASL, they're more of an English word order, what the deaf person will typically do is they'll code switch. So instead of using strong ASL language, they will change to more of a contact language. And that reason is because the person they're speaking with doesn't necessarily know strong ASL, and so they try to match their language skills. And so this is to prevent a lot of repetition, and so the deaf person doesn't need to constantly sign things over and over again. And so deaf people will very commonly code switch. And then when they are speaking with somebody who knows ASL and has that strong language, they'll code switch back to ASL. Often people who are learning sign language for the first time, they're very excited to meet a deaf person. But they commonly don't use ASL itself. It's more of a contact language, which would use more of a English word order structure. Okay, and then on to the next slide about deaf nod. So deaf nod itself has two functions. It depends on the situation itself. For example, so a door-to-door salesperson comes to your door, they're trying to sell something, and they just start with their speech. The deaf person will commonly nod, not necessarily meaning that they understand what the person is saying, but they just want that person to go away. They don't want to interact with that person, and so they'll nod along. And it's kind of like a hint to the hearing person that this person is deaf and they would rather like them to leave. And so they'll then leave the conversation. The separate function for deaf nod is if, say, you're in a large group and the deaf person is trying to speech read what is going on, but they're having a hard time, they could nod along, and many people might think that this means that this person is understanding and they're following the conversation. But in this situation, they're not. It's more of a, kind of like a masking, bluffing. So they're nodding along, but they're really not understanding what's going on. They might be catching a few pieces of information, but the full concept, they're not understanding. So they'll nod along. It helps them feel like they're part of the group. Often deaf people tend to look around for visual cues. And so if a hearing person is talking and somebody laughs at their comment, they'll join in and laugh as well. And a lot of people will see that and think, oh, this person is understanding, when in reality, they're not. The second part is called social bluffing. And we all know what social bluffing is, right? We've all done that before. And deaf and hard of hearing people are very highly skilled at this. Oftentimes, the deaf person will nod along and act like they know what's going on, but really they're not following that concept. And so you need to be careful just to make sure the person that you're speaking with really does understand what you're talking about and that your communication is clear with them. Moving on to, now if you're involved in a situation and there's a question that comes up a deaf person might nod along, but it doesn't always mean that it's a yes to your question. If your question is a yes or no, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're answering yes. It means that they're listening along. So you might have to test them a little bit and ask a question that forces them to answer something other than yes or no. And that's just something that you can kind of keep in the back of your mind when you're working with somebody who is deaf or hard of hearing. Okay. Let's see, and it's on to Jeannie.
The next part of language acquisition or communication access really that I want to mention is language acquisition. We've talked a little bit about the fact that 90% of all deaf people are born to hearing parents. We haven't really talked about how people acquire language, its exposure to language, and really how that impacts a person with hearing loss. So if a person with hearing loss is born to hearing parents and those parents don't learn how to communicate with that child with hearing loss, then what can happen is that child with hearing loss, and this is children who are hard of hearing or deaf, they end up with a delay in their language development. So parents with an infant who has a hearing loss, they have to be very intentional about teaching their child language development. They have to, if it's an infant who is hard of hearing, they have to make sure that they're facing their infant. They have to make sure that they're talking directly at their infant. They have to introduce all kinds of opportunities to communicate about specific things. They work with speech and language pathologists and with teachers and all kinds of staff to make sure that their kids are developing those language milestones on time. And so there's a lot of work that goes into it. With a deaf child, it's the same thing, except that those hearing parents typically don't learn ASL fluently. In fact, I recently read a study that showed that only 8% of those deaf kids have hearing parents who are able to have bi-directional conversations with them. So think about having your own kids at that dinner table that we saw earlier on in this presentation and talking with your kids about sex and drugs and alcohol and what they did at school today and calculus and who they would replace their principal with if they could choose who they were going to choose for a principal. Except now you can't do it because you don't know ASL. And now think about being your child's best language role model. How is that child going to develop language? You're going to encounter potentially a person who has what's called language disfluency because that person didn't have language exposure early on. And that window for language development closes by the time that child is 8 or 9 years old, probably earlier. And so those people have a harder time to access information because they don't have fluency in their own native language. Those people are going to have a limited vocabulary, they're going to have a lack of time reference, lack of syntax, and so their best option for language or communication access will be what's called a certified deaf interpreter. In Greater Minnesota, it's really hard to come up with those folks. In Greater Minnesota, your best bet is going to be to find a really highly qualified, certified ASL interpreter who is consistently working with that person, who is familiar with what's going on with that person, who is familiar with that person's history, to work with that person and with the service providers. There can be all kinds of ranges of language fluency and disfluency also. Jerry, do you have any comments to add to that by any chance?
Nope, I think you covered everything great.
Okay.
Okay, now I will talk about communication access for people that have a hearing loss, for hard of hearing exclusively. So with speech reading, many people who are hard of hearing do depend on speech reading to communicate. And some situations they can be quite successful if they are one-on-one with another person and the environment is quiet, there's not a lot of distractions. If it's a formal dialogue, they might be successful as well. If it's maybe a one-hour meeting and they have to depend on speech reading, that's something that might not be so successful. And so it really depends on that specific situation. Some areas, yes, speech reading can be effective while others are not. So 30% of the English language can be visible on the lips. And so that means that 70% of sounds, English sounds, are very difficult to understand because the way that you can create that noise, that sound, is either in your nose or in your throat. So the sound or k, you can't identify those on the lips. And so that's really hard to identify what that sound is. And so the person that is trying to speech read is not sure exactly what letter you're trying to use. An example is the letter B and the letter P. They look exactly the same when you make those sounds on your lips. And so it's hard to tell which letter you're trying to use, which will lead to a lot of misinformation. And so the bottom line is if the person is a very skilled speech reader, they're roughly able to catch about 30% of the information, which means that all of the other information can be filled in through different gaps in the language. For example, filling in the gaps might mean knowing what the topic is in that conversation, and if they have real-life experience that they can apply to it, that might be helpful. One example I'll give you is an English sentence. The dog was, and the first four letters is kind of blurry. You don't know what that speech is, and then it ends with an ing, and it was loud. The dog was blanking loud. And so thinking of your life experience, you know that it means barking. The dog was barking loudly. That's what we as deaf and hard of hearing people need to do. We need to fill in those gaps and make sense of what the sentence might be. Some English words are very long or they're very technical, so it might be very difficult to speech read those words. And so it'd be important to replace those with more common language that will help the person speech read and understand the message a little bit clearer. And I do have to warn you that people who are deaf and hard of hearing, not many of them are skilled speech readers. A few are. So you should ask them beforehand if they're comfortable using speech reading or if they would prefer another mode of communication.
Can I ask one thing, Jerry?
Sure.
Don't assume that if they say yes, it's still a great way to communicate with that person.
Right, yes.
Especially if it's really important information. If you're okay with them guessing at 70% of what you're saying, then go for it.
Yes, yep.
Absolutely.
Okay. So clear speech reading. So I want to give you a little bit of a picture, kind of a visual about clear speech reading. It will help if you are speaking slowly, if you're speaking clearly, if you can increase the volume a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit. If you can break it up into different phrases, And I think that's the most important piece that will help people who are deaf or hard of hearing to speech read, is to break your sentence up in different phrases. That pause will allow that person to process what the beginning part of that phrase was, and then you can go on and add the rest of the sentence or piece of information. Those pauses are very important.
I can give you some examples of some clear speeching. So I'll provide the full sentence. So my husband's sister is coming to visit us in Florida in April. Now, if you notice, there were no pauses. With a hard of hearing individual, they often need time to process it. Therefore, without the breaks, that processing will suffer. So if you put in meaningful pauses, such as in this sentence that I just read to you, my husband's sister is coming to visit us in Florida in April. So you let them think about that my husband's sister, okay, that's who, they're coming, okay, and then you state the whereabouts and then the time. So it's important to give those individuals time to process and to make sure that they're catching the important parts of each information or each sentence. Those pauses are brief. It's just long enough to keep the flow, not interrupt the sentence, but provide those cognitive pauses. Just time for them to have that processing. Research has proven that an individual who uses clear speech techniques versus for a person with a hearing loss, that individual will actually pick up 40% more with those pauses than the typical 30%. So 40% on top of that is a huge improvement of understanding about 70% of the language. Still not 100%, but a big improvement. The clear speech techniques are very important and can be proven effective, especially with those individuals who depend on or rely on speech reading. And again, you need to slow down a little, speak a little bit louder, enunciate clearly, and don't over-enunciate, and be cognizant of those pauses in meaningful spots. All right. The next one is on assistive listening devices. I believe Liz mentioned this. The assistive devices are an alternative sometimes in replacement for hearing aids. If people don't have them, they can opt to use other devices and other assistive listening devices. Like they have like playing cards the size of an iPhone or the size of an iPhone that can help pick up sounds. It's an assistive listening device that can help amplify the noise straight into the person's nerves in their ears so that they can then hear a little bit clearer. So pairing equipment like enhanced hearing function can help those individuals who need assisted listening devices. Hearing aids themselves are just a small electronic device that you place on or inside the ear. There's 3 different parts: the microphone, the amplifier, and the speaker. That's what all the basic ones have. The microphone is what picks up the sound wave, and then it's converted to the electrical signal that then goes into the amplifier that is then amplified to increase the volume into the speaker, which goes directly into one's brain. You might want to, Liz, if you could go back just one. I just wanted to clarify one thing. With the hearing aids are not a fix for hearing loss. It's not going to restore your hearing. It will improve your ability to hear in that moment with the hearing aid on, but it does not fix it. Hearing aids and with vision loss, when you have a vision loss and you put glasses on, that's a quick fix to that. So you will notice that with the glasses on, you will then be able to see a 20/20. If you put a hearing aid on a hearing loss, it does not fix it, it does not correct it. It will amplify it enough, but not bring you up to the level of normal hearing. And so communication access for people with hearing loss or late deafened. CART, that's the Communicated Assistive Real-Time Transcript. So that, either one, the CART is used to transmit a visual transcript of live communications. Liz had mentioned CART previously, just like they use for the court reporters. You have to hire a person to come in who will then listen to what's happening, transcribe everything up onto the screen for people who are dependent on that to be able to read and keep up with the conversation. That helps to receive the information for those who have some degree of hearing loss. The second thing is some people will use, written language for communication access. For senior citizens, it typically is not the best mode or not something that one should actually rely on. And the last one is, like I mentioned, any form of technology, CART, the hearing aids, assisted listening devices. Those are, in aids to help somebody communicate better. Oh, so neat. All right, I'm just taking a peek at this slide here. So, in regards to deaf-blind, it's something that people need to get creative about because deaf-blind individuals, they all have different or varying needs. Some people are fully blind, some people are completely deaf, some people have some residual hearing or some ability to see in different ways. So the communication for deaf-blind individuals varies quite a bit. Those who are fully blind and fully deaf, again, their communication needs still depend on the individual. Pro-tactile is a form of communication using, an interpreter who is behind the deaf-blind individual, feeding visual information about the surrounding area. So for example, if a deaf-blind individual is in a conference or in a workshop and they have an interpreter in front of them close enough so that they can see, they would have another interpreter standing just behind them, signifying like a tap on their back with all 5 fingers of both hands would signify that somebody in the room or multiple people in the room are laughing, so that you can feel the environment. Then you feel like as though you become a part of the environment. You get that additional information that you lose without the ability to see or hear. Tactile is the ability to use the hand over hand, so hand over hand sign language. So if you are signing into the palm of another individual's hand is considered tactile, so that you can depend on touch instead of the visual cues of ASL. And tracking is for those who maybe have some vision. They will often put their hands on the interpreter's forearm so they can feel the signs, they can feel the movement of the signs, as well as depending on the little bit of residual sight that they do have. The last one, assisted listening devices, are for people who are blind but can hear or have some residual hearing and don't depend on sign language. They depend on their the audio ability to get information, would use assisted listening devices. That would not work for someone who is profoundly deaf with a vision loss. So, if you're needing information or want to, connect with a deafblind individual, there are 3 organizations that can provide information: the Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services, that's where all 3 of us are currently housed, and there's the Deafblind Services of Minnesota, and then they have the State Services for the Blind. There are several resources with a wealth of information on how to work with them, how to communicate, and just different information for working with those individuals.
Okay, this is Liz, and I'm going to go back to never make assumptions. And we're going to share some myths that are pretty stereotypical for those who really don't know or understand specifically the deaf culture. These myths have been circulated widely throughout our society, and it sort of interferes with understanding people who are deaf. Just going to list a couple because in your packet you have what we call a fact sheet. And that fact sheet lists a number of additional myths. The first one that you see here is people who are deaf are less intelligent. And that could not be any further from wrong. The inability to hear has nothing to do, is totally unrelated to intelligence. There are people in the hearing world on one end of the language continuum that struggle to communicate, struggle to understand, and then the opposite end of the continuum are people who are extremely bright and do extensively well in communicating. I'm thinking of an individual who is deafblind. I won't say what area of the state he lives in, but he is brilliant. He is a writer, so he's creative, has had a business, he's a father, he's a husband, he is extremely talented, and this person has no vision and no hearing. So that example alone should let us know that all people who are deaf are less intelligent is absolutely incorrect. All people who are deaf read lips. Again, it's a myth. It's not a fact. Some people who are deaf are very skilled speech readers, but that's because they have spent many, many years learning the craft. They are skillful because, again, they have learned the craft and they have been able to pick up, oftentimes, language at some point in time. As Jeannie and as Jerry have already said, only 30% of spoken English is visible on the lips. And that is because, Jerry I think has already said this, that many speech sounds have identical mouth movements. For example, the letter P as in Paul and the letter B, as in ball, look exactly the same on the lips. And that's true with lots of words. I will share one little example of something that's rare, but you will encounter, or you may encounter, an individual who is profoundly deaf, never learned sign language, and functions extremely well as a speech reader. There are a few of them out there that we have worked with over the years. I sat in a training many years ago with a young woman who sat at the very front, and she watched me so intensely that I thought something was wrong with my face. So during the break, I said to her, "Are you okay? You know, is something, are you struggling with anything? Because I noticed you're really intense." And she said, in a very clear voice, "I'm deaf, and I don't know sign language. I speech read." She said, "You're very easy to speech read." I'm like, okay, good. Okay, good. She's one of those rare people. Another gentleman we worked with, again, years ago, probably 20-plus years ago, came into our office, and when he entered the office, I didn't know him at the time, I could hear him in the very back. So we are talking almost a fourth of a block from the front door to where my cube is. And I could hear him as clearly as a bell. He couldn't hear. He's profoundly deaf. But he learned to speech read, and he learned to speak at an early age before he became completely deaf. But because he could not hear, he did not realize how loud his voice was, or the volume, and he had no ability to control it. So those are my two examples in 30 years of individuals that are out there that are, and I know of others. When we travel, we do encounter individuals who use speech reading as their only method of communicating. But again, they are a rare breed. The next myth we'd like to dispel is hearing aids fix hearing loss. I can thank Jerry because he just said that. He just shared that a hearing aid only amplifies sound. It doesn't matter what the sound is, that's what's being amplified. There's no clarity coming with that hearing aid. It just does not fix the hearing loss. It does not restore hearing, and that's the fact that we want you to really remember. All people, another myth that's out there, a couple more that I just want to share. All people who are deaf use hearing aids. Well, of course, that's just not true. You will encounter individuals wearing a hearing aid who are profoundly deaf, and you will wonder, well, if they are deaf, what is the purpose of the hearing aid if it's amplifying sound? What it's doing is it's allowing them to pick up sounds in the environment. If they're outside and there's an ambulance coming, they will know that, first of all, visually, they will see it before most of us will drive because they're so in tune to the environment, but they will maybe be able to pick up that siren. And so that's why you may encounter individuals who are profoundly deaf wearing a hearing aid. They're picking up environmental sounds. We were in the office one day, and one of my coworkers was deaf, and someone dropped a desk on the floor above us. And, you know, like the rest of us who jumped, he jumped too, because his hearing aid allowed him to know that something hit something above him. So we have many other myths listed on the fact sheet that's included in your resources. So we're not going to continue with the myths because you can actually read them.
All right, communication strategy is really a person-centered focus. And so person-centered services basically mean that you collaborate and you work with that person. And so it's an equal sharing, kind of a partnership. So they can get whatever services that they need. And I want to make it clear, though, that it doesn't mean it's whatever they ask for, we will guaranteed give them. That's not the truth, no. It's more of an understanding that we will determine what they need in regards to their family or their communication style, and we'll be more understanding of what they need so we can accommodate them and we can provide the access that they need and try to grant the request that they have. But it's very important for that person to have their communication met. And so if you meet a person who is deaf or hard of hearing or somebody that has a hearing loss, you might need to adjust the accommodations so they can be successful and you can achieve the goals that they have. Communication strategies regarding technology, there's quite a few, and most of them we've already covered. CART, assistive listening devices, texting on your phone, video phone. Video phone is used by people who are deaf that sign, and they tend to use a webcam connected to their computer, and they'll connect on, and what will happen is there'll be an interpreter that they have access to, and that interpreter will make a direct call to somebody who is hearing, and so they can use much like a telephone through an interpreter. Video phones are becoming very popular in the deaf community, and it allows that deaf person to connect with the outside world. Okay. So ASL interpreters. There are 3 different kinds. The first is face-to-face. This will happen if you are providing a service. You will hire in an ASL interpreter, and they will come to that location. They're a nationally certified interpreter, and means that they have went through a training program. They've taken their certification exam. Sometimes it's not easy to get an interpreter. We do know that. So these interpreters need to follow the professional code of professional conduct. Confidentiality is very important in this professional conduct. So in the room, if they hear any piece of information, they can't share that once they leave that room. It's very strict guidelines that they need to follow. Basically, what an interpreter does is when somebody who is hearing is speaking, they take in that information and they sign that information for the deaf person. The deaf person will then take in that information, respond, and the interpreter will speak verbally what they say. It's a very interactive communication. Another type of interpreting they can do is transliterating, which is following more of an English word order kind of communication style. The next is VRI. Sometimes located in rural areas, there's not many interpreters available. And so people will use VRI services, which are video remote interpreting services. A company will hire in a video remote interpreter. They'll need to set up an iPad or a computer, connect to the internet, and then an interpreter will be available online. This could happen at a doctor's office, where an interpreter could be used inside the office, and it's often used in rural areas. But doesn't necessarily mean that VRI is effective. It might not be equal access. It's difficult to move a VRI interpreter to another room because they are dependent on technology, so you might have to stop the interpreting services, reconnect in a separate room, so it doesn't necessarily mean that it's equal communication access. The next is a CDI, which is a certified deaf interpreter. And so this is a deaf person who knows ASL and English very well, and they'll oftentimes be paired with a hearing interpreter, and they'll work together as a team. The hearing person will speak. The hearing interpreter will take in the information and sign it. The certified deaf interpreter will take that information, process it, and make it clear for the deaf person. So a CDI is used if the deaf participant has minimal language skills, if a hearing interpreter is not sure how to communicate with them, or if they're struggling, you could bring in a certified deaf interpreter to help that situation. If the deaf person has English as their second language, if they don't know ASL, or if they're much more gestural, bringing in a CDI will help smooth that communication. And sometimes with those situations, you can have just a hearing interpreter, and they'll provide communication access just fine, but other times you do need to have that CDI. And what's really important is just that communication is relayed between all of the participants.
Okay, and now we're going to take just a few moments to talk about some communication tips. The ones that you see up here are critical, but there are several more that, again, are in your packet. When we talk about communicating with someone with a hearing loss, be they deaf or hard of hearing, you have already learned throughout the past hour and a half that people communicate in a variety of ways. Some use speech reading, some use signs, some use writing, or a combination of several of those. Many individuals with a hearing loss may feel left out of social situations. So be it a social situation, be it on the job, be it in the community, be it just in your environment, it's okay to ask the person with the hearing loss what you can do to improve their communication process. Ask them if assistive listening devices may be helpful. Ask them if going to a different room might be helpful. When you are communicating critical or really complex information, use the preferred communication or accommodation of the person with the hearing loss. They know what works best for them. So it's okay to ask them, and then hopefully to be able to provide. And that's where our office can come in. We can actually do a lot of one-on-one with you when you're encountering situations that just may be a little more challenging. The first tip that's listed on this screen is communicate in a well-lit and quiet area. Face the person that you're communicating with, face them directly, hopefully on the same level if you're both sitting or if both are standing, in good light whenever possible. Position yourself so that the light is shining on the speaker's face, or position yourself so that the light is shining on the speaker's face and not on yours. Get the other person's attention. You know, this sounds so elementary, to get someone's attention before you start speaking. But as hearing people, we just say, Jeannie, Heidi, we call and we expect a response. Jeremy, with someone who has a profound hearing loss, you may need to do some tapping on the shoulder or on the upper arm. You might need to wave a sheet of paper or something to their side so that they know you're trying to get their attention. There's some, you know, if you're at a table like we're sitting today and I want to get Diana's attention and she has a hearing loss, I may just push the table so that she can feel there's some movement going on that will cause her to look up.
Liz, can I just say that I have a hearing loss, small, and people start talking to me without getting my attention all the time. And I just automatically ask them to repeat themselves because I won't know what they're talking about.
Exactly. So it really is, it sounds elementary, but it's critical. Get their attention first before you start a conversation. Maintain eye contact. It's really considered disrespectful to be talking with a person, signing with them, or watching the interpreter or communicating with the deaf person especially, and then break away without any type of explanation. You can say, excuse me, be back in a minute, or the phone's ringing. Let them know that you need to break away. That's very respectful. Then get the person's attention again when you come back to the conversation. This gives that listener a chance to sort of refocus their attention and reduce the chance of missing words, as Jeannie just said at the beginning of a conversation. It's very common. Rephrase, don't repeat. Research has shown that if we repeat information, regardless of how short or how long it is, 2, 3, 4 times, if the person missed it the first time and the second time and the third time, they're going to continue to miss it. So don't repeat the information, rephrase the information. One of the simple things that we've used over the years is instead of saying a quarter, use the words 25 cents. That's easier to read, easier to follow for someone who's trying to follow you. Avoid standing in front of bright lights or windows because that person, then you become dark and the person can't read you. Speak at a normal rate. Don't over-exaggerate your speech because it will only cause more confusion. And again, it's fine to use, and I don't have that on here on this PowerPoint, but it's really fine to use facial expressions and gestures. As a hearing person who does not know the language, especially if the person is deaf, it's okay to use gestures to get to information, share information. It's okay to point. As hearing people, we don't point. In the deaf world, pointing is a part of the language. So you point to the appropriate objects, or using visual aids can also be helpful. And again, there are numerous other communication tips in your packet as resources.
Okay, and I'll just briefly discuss effective written communication. So if you find yourself in a situation where you have to write back and forth with an individual, I really want to emphasize 2 things here. When you're writing back and forth, be brief and to the point. You know, don't create complex sentences. There's no need. The general deaf population, their culture is direct and to the point. Hearing culture tends to fluff things and, add the longer way of saying things. It's just culturally appropriate for both. But when you're communicating by written language with a deaf individual, be short and to the point. Choose specific words, choose words that are more commonly used, or using specific things aren't always appropriate. So if you for example, if you're using that word, some people may prefer a different word, maybe prefer to say find out instead of a more complicated word like commence, to start. If commence is a word that's more difficult to understand, use the word start, to fabricate something. instead use a different word that's more commonly used. If a deaf individual doesn't use the word or doesn't understand that word, try to find something that is more concise and to the point. So if you are using more concise language, it's easier to just read through a quick sentence and understand it. But if you use more vague language or a longer way of saying something, it can oftentimes lead to miscommunication or misunderstandings. Avoid jargon. Jargon and different idioms or different English-based phrases don't always work out. There's a list of thousands of idioms that people use on a daily basis that are not transferable to ASL. We have about 14 idioms in sign language, that's all. So idioms are not successful in relaying information between a hearing person and a deaf person. ASL is a visual language. And if you are saying it's raining cats and dogs, imagine that visually. A cat and a dog falling from the sky, it doesn't make sense. Because ASL is based on visual. So if you're saying it's 3 sheets to the wind, a deaf person visualizes 3 sheets in the wind. It just does not make sense. So really try to avoid using jargon and idioms when you are using written communication with a deaf individual. And maybe consider typing things on a computer or an iPhone or iPad instead of writing. I know, some people may have good penmanship and some may not. It might be a struggle just to read one's handwriting. So using a computer, an iPad, or an iPhone are also other options. One thing I want to emphasize or add here is that if you ask a deaf individual if they can write back and forth and the deaf individual accepts that, know that a preference of an interpreter would be there, but they're willing to write back and forth. So is writing back and forth the most effective way of communication? Probably not. So you have to keep that in the back of your mind, that they are willing to accept written form of communication, but it's not the preferred form of communication. Okay. So if you meet an individual who has minimal English skills, or for example, if you are needing to get information from an individual and you ask, I'm trying to see this, I'm sorry, when did you last eat? So you're looking for, the information that you need based on that sentence. What did you use to get that information? Okay, eat, when. So instead of saying, when did you last eat, you can simplify that as eat when. Another example is, how long have you worked here? The information you are really getting is how long and work. So if you write that down, work here, how long, is more concise and to the point. The next two examples you can see on the PowerPoint here. So it just gives you an idea on how to simplify the information. Get the information that you need, pick that from the sentence, and write it in a more clear, concise way. Typically for deaf people who are not fluent with English or don't have great English skills. Writing back and forth can be difficult, but there are, you know, some who that could be an easy form of communication. So it just varies based on the individual.
Okay, we're wrapping up here. We're down to identifying resources. Okay, in your packet, you're going to find a number of resources that you can use to access us first. We first listed Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services Division because we are statewide. So if you use either of the numbers that are listed on the brochure, we will be able to assist you or refer you or transfer you to someone who can.
Plus, we're really awesome.
We are. We really like working with people. Deaf and Hard of Hearing Service Division is made up of 3 major programs, and the 3 major programs are the direct service work that both Jeannie and Jerry and I also do, working one-on-one with individuals who are deaf, deafblind, hard of hearing, and late deafened. The whole purpose of meeting with them one-on-one is to improve communication access wherever they are, in homes, at the work site, in the community, to provide communication tips, sometimes not only to them, but to the individuals, the service providers that they're working with. Not only communication tips, but coping strategies for the person with the hearing loss. We offer guidance, problem solving, and referrals on a regular basis. Also, we work to increase their awareness of assistive technology. The TED program, we call it the TED program. It's the Telecommunication Equipment Distribution Program. That program provides telephone equipment. It is available at no cost, as is all of our services, to eligible Minnesotans who have a hearing loss, but also who have a speech impairment or a physical disability. That's the additional options that you have for the TED program. Okay. Then we have a mental health services program. That program has qualified counselors who are fluent in sign language and provide culturally affirmative counseling. They provide case coordination, aftercare, planning, and community placement and assistance to individuals and families. And that's just some of what we do on a regular basis.
And the mental health, sorry Liz, the mental health services are free.
All of the services that we provide in the division come to the public free at no cost. We provide trainings and consulting to numerous service providers throughout the state. And again, all of the trainings are free. Some more resources that you might find helpful when you're encountering individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing. The first one you see is HLAA. HLAA is the Hearing Loss Association of America, and they are known for providing information, education, support, and advocacy. They've been around since 1979, and they really focus on persons living with a hearing loss to help them live fully and productive lives. They actually were just here. Their national conference was here about a month ago. So it's a phenomenal organization especially for individuals who are hard of hearing. There is a local chapter that meets in, the Twin Cities local chapter meets in, how can I lose that? Courage Center, every 3rd Saturday of the month. So, and it's open. You will be able to see and interact with others who have a hearing loss, but you also will be able to receive all the information through CART services every month. The National Association of the Deaf is just that. It's the nation's premier civil rights organization. It's of, by, and for deaf and hard of hearing persons in the U.S. It was established back in 1880, And the NAD, National Association of the Deaf, was actually shaped by deaf leaders who believed in the right of the American deaf community to use sign language, to congregate on issues important to them, and to have its interests represented at the national level. Legal resources that you're going to find beneficial, the Minnesota Disability Law Center is located in Minneapolis, and that service, even though they have a few persons on their staff, they often will provide guidance to individuals dealing with discrimination. The Great Lakes ADA Center is my speed dial number because they were created by the federal government, and there are 10 ADA centers throughout the country. Our area works under the Great Lakes Technical and Business Center in Chicago. Their number is there. They not only provide information to us as service providers, they will actually work with individuals who have questions related to rights, laws, ADA-specific related questions. So that number is there not only for us, the service providers, but for individuals who have questions that need to hear it from someone who works with ADA information on a daily basis. And then the last two resources, the Minnesota Chemical Dependency Treatment Center for Deaf and Hard of Hearing persons is located in the metro area. It's in Minneapolis, and if there's a need, that number is there for you. You can also work through us in getting a hold of them. And the last resource that I think we have listed is the interpreter referral agencies. There are at least 7 in the metro area, and several of them provide services statewide. So you really want to become familiar with the interpreter referral agencies. Please see the attachments that are in the resources that were attached.
And I think we're ready for questions if there are any.
Maybe I could have one of those. Thank you. We have let me go back. There's one question that came in about the resources. So it should be that when you log in to the webinar that there are links. If for some reason you don't have the links to the documents to download, let us know and we will make sure that those are available to everybody. But they should have been, they were attached to the, when I tried to log in, I saw them there as part of an attachment to the presentation. So hopefully everybody saw them. So if you're looking for those, go there to find the downloads. And everything will be posted on HB 101 sometime this week under the Partners tab. Okay, go to the Partners tab. There'll be the video, there'll be the PowerPoint, and there'll be all the attachments. And the recording, will the recording yes. also? And so if you want to go back, come back through it and catch something that you missed, we also recorded the webinar today. So it'll be posted there as well. So. Okay, so the other question that came in so far, and if you do have a question, please send it into the Q&A box, not to the chat box. But the other question that came in is, will people be offended if you write short 2-word sentences like in the examples that you gave on the box of 4, or the slide with the 4 boxes of different questions? Will people be offended if you use the short writing will they assume that you're thinking that they're uneducated or talking down to them?
Well, first of all, when you meet a deaf person and you start writing back and forth, you can kind of judge their English skills and you can match their level of English competency. And then from there, you can communicate on their language level. Because if you're reading information and it's evident that at about a 10th grade reading level that's kind of the baseline that you should start writing at. And so whether you're hearing or if you're deaf or hard of hearing, starting at the 10th grade reading level is a good start. And so if they're not understanding at the 10th grade reading level, and it's clear, you need to kind of bring it down a little bit to match their skills.
I would add something too, and that is that sometimes you can use, if it's a person who's hard of hearing and it's a brief interaction, sometimes you can use your cell phone or an iPad and get an app with a speech-to-text capability, and sometimes that can be very helpful also, but it just depends really on what you're trying to accomplish.
Good. That's really helpful. Thank you. At the moment, we don't have any other questions, so that means you guys did a good job of communicating a lot of helpful information. Are there any other questions for anybody that's out there listening? This is a great time to do that. You obviously would be able to send them later if you need to, but for the benefit of everybody, if you've got a question, there's always a good chance that somebody else has a similar question, so this is a great time to tap into some serious expertise here. I don't see any more questions coming in, so if any come in after the fact, I'll make sure that they get passed along to our panelists here. Heidi, did you have anything to add?
I have nothing to add, but please do complete the survey that will be sent to you shortly.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you all for joining today.
Yes, thank you.